Okay, guess we get started right now. Thank you everybody for being here today. We have a wonderful panel discussion on the works, and there's going to be 4 panelists. And the topic is embodied carbon measurement, benchmarking, and setting meaningful targets. A few logistics for today. The webinar is being recorded, or the panel is going to be recorded. We want this to be an open conversation. So after we have 3 main questions that will be asked to the panelists, and they can answer from all their different perspectives. But after that, we're going to have a significant amount of time for Q&A, and feel free to ask all your questions. We, as always, like since we are not like a super big, humongous webinar with hundreds of people, feel free to unmute yourself and turn on your camera when the Q&A time comes. And otherwise, type your questions to the chat, and we will be directing those to our panelists today. So with that, the agenda is going to be welcome, as always, from the CLF, the panel discussion, and then the Q&A. Some embodied carbon news. USGBC has released this report that is advancing building decarbonization, and they just open up for comments on the LEED B5 rating system as of yesterday. So if you were not aware, do a search for LEED B5 and open comments for the rating system updates. Also, we wanted to mention that the Carbon Utilization Procurement Grants Program, the deadline to apply is April 30th. And also a big win and big congratulations to 6 different company projects that they were awarded with 1.6 billion federal investment for reducing embodied carbon in the cement and concrete industry. So this Rocky Mountain Hub is led by 4 different co-chairs. It's all volunteering time, and Michaela De Russo with Building Transparency. We have Dorian Krause with Pathways, and Bailey Vigil with the Office of the State Architect, and myself with Meet and Hunt. So the Carbon Leadership Forum is an industry academic collaboration hosted at the University of Washington. And there are different hubs across the nation and even internationally as of right now. There are options for learning more and talking to other people within the field, within the Carbon Leadership Forum current focus groups, that they are part of the CLF community. So if you haven't done, and you can create a free account with the CLF community, and then you can link yourself to any of the groups that you're interested to. Feel free to always contact us via email, through personal email, or the CLF Rocky Mountain Hub at gmail.com. We have a LinkedIn page, and also we have a mailing list. So if you haven't signed up, please, if you're interested in signing up, please mention it on the chat, and one of us will send you the link. The webinar will be accessible as well in our YouTube channel. So with that said, let's go ahead and start with our panelist introductions for today. So Joshua Clement, he works for Branch Pattern. Joshua is here, and he's gonna tell you a little bit about himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Clement. I am currently a project manager and LCA practitioner with Branch Pattern on the materials team. I specialize in whole building lifecycle assessment with a focus on embodied carbon. I've been in this role for the last 2 years now. And prior to this, I was working in the drinking water industry and attending graduate school. My background is mainly in environmental science and environmental engineering, but I've been active in sustainability for most of my professional career as well.
Thank you, Josh. And next panelist, we have Jenny Embrek with Prologis.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Jenny Emmerich, and I'm the Global Construction Sustainability Manager at Prologis, which is a real estate company that builds, owns, and operates logistics facilities around the world. And I am responsible for managing Prologis's carbon accounting program and working with our sustainability consultants, Branch Pattern being one of them, to collect and analyze LCA data for our new developments. And Prologis recently committed to achieving carbon neutral construction by 2025 and net zero emissions across its value chain by 2040. So I work with internal stakeholders like our ESG and innovation teams to help shape Prologis's decarbonization strategy as part of that net zero goal by 2040.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenny. And next, we have Kaylee Howd with Bureau Hapol. Kaylee?
Hi, everyone. Kaylee Howd. So I have been with Bureau Hapol for the last 10 years. I'm an associate principal and the global computational projects lead. So in my role at BH, I've developed several different sustainability tools, our life cycle assessment toolkit, and our building performance dashboard, which focuses on benchmarking, which is very relevant to this conversation. I also am an adjunct professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach parametric life cycle assessment. So those tools that I have designed through the open source code platform BOM at Bureau Happold. I also am the chair of MEP 2040 commitment. Join our forums if you haven't. I also am a member of the ECHO project, which also fits in very nicely with this conversation. And I'm a member of the Center of Excellence in Building Decarbonization through ASHRAE as well.
Awesome, Kaylee. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Chris Pike with GRASP.
Hey, I'm nice to be here. My name is Chris Pike, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for GRASP. GRASP is, as some of you know, a Dutch company focused on providing sustainability standards, reporting, and benchmarking for both property and infrastructure companies. This is my second trip with GRASP. I formerly served as the Chief Operating Officer for GRASP. I also have spent about 10 years working for the U.S. Green Building Council. I'm an environmental scientist by background, and I also, on the side, echoing what we heard earlier, I teach urban and regional planning at Georgetown. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm going to stop my sharing. Whoops. I'm doing something really wrong. Here, stop share. Okay. So now let's go to the questions that we have for today. And again, for those that join a little bit later, there's a 3 set of questions that we're going to ask to all our panelists. And but of course, there's going to be a Q&A and open conversation. So after those 3 questions have been answered, we will start the Q&A, and feel free to start turning your cameras on and asking the question directly, or type it into the chat. So with that, so dear panelists, with more and more building owners, companies, cities, and states establishing the decarbonization goals, what are the best approaches for measuring and tracking embodied carbon reductions? And let's start with Joshua, if you want.
Sure, yeah. So embodied carbon can be a relatively tricky topic to try to address. Embodied carbon performance can depend pretty significantly on location, market, and building use type. And it often requires a lot of communication across the supply chain to get good, accurate data. So I think the biggest thing you can do is start trying to collect that information and collect that data as soon as you can. One of the biggest hurdles we often face is a lack of quality data when trying to account for embodied carbon, because there's so many pieces that go into it. So this stands true for regardless of where you fall on the supply chain. For developers, that could mean looking at your current typical practices and designs, whether that be at the building level, project level, or portfolio level, because assessing those current practices really allows you to set up a framework for understanding how to improve in the future. For GCs and project teams, that means looking at material sourcing and tracking. Material types and quantities are really what drives the ability to track embodied carbon. And for GCs and subs, they have access to the highest quality of data because they're the ones bringing those materials in. So starting to look at those things as early as you can, I think really will help drive the accuracy and the ability to account for these large projects in terms of embodied carbon. And then for manufacturers, that means understanding how the product stage impacts of materials are being produced. So that means looking at how the raw materials are collected and transported, the energy impacts associated with production of a product, and ways to look specifically at embodied carbon include pursuing environmental product declarations, which are just product level life cycle assessments that can be used to then look at the entire building project. And so all of those players in the process need to work together in order to organize this information and figure out a system that works for understanding your own embodied carbon footprint, because again, one size doesn't necessarily fit all when you're looking at embodied carbon.
Victoria, you're on mute.
Thank you. And I was just saying, maybe Jenny wants to continue speaking up now in regards to how an owner might see these.
Right. Well, and so to echo what Josh said, in order to start tracking any sort of progress in terms of an embodied carbon reduction, you have to establish a baseline to measure against. So you have to start measuring. And so that's why Prologis started measuring the embodied carbon impact of all of our new developments in 2023. So we're building this internal database of embodied carbon data for our buildings, and we'll be able to establish an internal 2023 benchmark based on all those LCA studies that we did, or I should say Branch Pattern did, because Branch Pattern did it. They complete all the LCAs with a software called OneClick, and so that helps to ensure that we're measuring the GHG emissions of a project in a consistent and transparent manner that's in line with LCA standards. And a big component of the implementation of the Prologis carbon accounting program, which I know Josh is familiar with, is the change management and really helping our Prologis development managers, our external consultants, general contractors especially, really understand the LCA process and what sort of project data is required in order to complete that LCA. So it's been a really big push by Prologis as well as Branch Pattern and our other LCA consultants that we use across the globe to introduce the carbon accounting process and really get people used to it and understand how it works. But after doing it for a little over a year now, we're definitely making some progress. And, again, as Josh said, looking for ways to improve that process and get the, the highest quality data possible so that we can get accurate LCA results.
You and Kaylee, I'm sure you have you wear so many different hats that you have so many different perspectives. So
Yeah, I think there are a few fundamental things here that the ECHO project actually has gotten to with the ECHO project's idea overall. So ECHO stands for the Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization Project. So the idea overall, if you think about it as two different buckets, first you want to create building functional equivalents because you don't want to be comparing a little warehouse in the Midwest to Amazon's new headquarters in Seattle. Those would be completely different buildings in terms of their embodied carbon and also their operational carbon. And thinking about the whole life carbon of a building is very important. And that B6 stage still tends to be about 70% of the whole life carbon of a building I'm a mechanical engineer by background, so I have to advocate for that. So I think thinking about the functional equivalence of a building, those are things like the number of stories above grade, the number of stories below grade. SE 2050 has taught us that that is incredibly important in terms of differentiating buildings' embodied carbon. The spacing of your columns, the bay size, the window to wall ratio, the form factor for facades. If your building is shaped like a star versus being shaped like a square, you're going to have very different facades embodied carbon. There are other factors about your building other than just your A1 to A3 embodied carbon overall for a particular discipline that matter. And I think thinking about those other facets of our buildings, because the purpose actually is what's driving us here. Why are we measuring? It's to decarbonize the built environment, because we know that we have a tremendous responsibility for the planet being decarbonized, right? So I think if we can understand what would actually drive decarbonization, those are the things that we should be measuring. And that's what we're trying to get at through the ECHO project, is coming up with a schema, which is the list of fields that you would report, because that's what will drive the policy in the United States toward having, these are the things that you should report, and here's why you should report these fields, and trying to get to the minimum viable product there. Like, what are the things with the minimum number of fields we should be reporting? So there's building functional equivalence. And then also, let's all talk apples to apples in terms of what we're reporting by scope. Because if you look at frameworks like ILFI or LEED, they're only asking you to report certain scopes and only certain stages. So if you look at ILFI, for example, it's A1 to A5, and it's structures, foundations, enclosures, and interiors. So I think understanding exactly which stages and which scopes, that's not whole building, and that's not whole life carbon. And I think really having a full understanding of what whole building, whole life carbon would look like. And when you're comparing apples to apples, knowing which apples I'm comparing with your apples, and being able to effectively compare those two. Because if you're organized and structured in your computational framework, putting that hat on myself, I can just compare your structures A1 to A3 with my structures A1 to A3 from my academic building with your academic building in the same climate zone, and we'd be okay. We're going to be okay because we're talking the same language. But I think previously, when we tried to do benchmarking as an industry, we didn't have some of those facets to be able to compare ourselves effectively. But now I think we're getting closer to the right kinds of questions to be able to ask those questions effectively. And let's just report it one time versus reporting it for ILFI and for LEED and for the US and for New York and for Vancouver and for all of the, and for MEP 2040 and SE 2050 and AIA 2030. Calm down. Like, let's stop reporting it 10 times. Can we just report it once in the middle and then just share that reporting for whatever insights you'd like to get? All right, off my soap.
Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you, Kaylee. Chris, we'll love to hear what your opinion on this is.
Sure, I'll try to build on what others are saying. And in this context, I'll represent the scale that GRESS tends to work at, which is the owner and the investor, and what is being asked. And so maybe I'll take it a little bit differently. So some things that really resonate from the conversation so far. As Josh told us at the beginning, getting information about materials and their qualities is the very first. So let me step back for a second. So for GRESS. Just for those who don't know, if I just put my GRESS hat on, GRESS breaks the world up into basically investor-owned property companies, and we think, and the world of embodied lives in something called the development assessment. We also do management and performance, and so within the development assessment, hundreds of companies around the world report on these practices. So we have a little insight into what people are doing, and very much trying to develop standards for the way that companies are managed, not individual buildings, but the way that companies are managed, and that includes that progression from materials transparency, including asking for environmental product information and even health product information, and attempting to collect information about how different companies tackle the issues that we were just talking about in terms of the scope, the stage, and the method. So from where I'll kind of take that in two directions. One, I love the idea that we all, as Kaylee said, do it once and report it everywhere. That is not a world I live in, not even close, not even. And I love the idea, and we definitely want to get there. But the world that we live in with GRESP this year is, we understand all of the, we see companies doing all of the divisions that Kaylee just said based on scope, stage, and we recognize 13 different assessment protocols that are out there in the world. And so the proliferation of ideas, the proliferation of data sources, the proliferation of stuff, and not just methods, but fundamentally different objectives. So asking, like, what is the purpose of benchmarking one academic building against another one versus should we be benchmarking a building against itself across design scenarios, or so forth and so on. So there are a lot of fundamental questions, and there isn't some easy way to agree. The last thing what I want to express is this matters at the level of companies and funds around the world. US companies and funds, from what we can see in data, are modestly behind their peers in other regions. So our European and Australian companies are modestly ahead, but not radically ahead. There is still a lot of LCA. There is a lot of embodied carbon tracking in the US. Not quite as much as there is in Australia, not quite as much as there is in Europe. And the last thing I'll say is, I do think it's important for folks in this community to realize that there is that while many people absolutely positively believe that the evolution of dealing with carbon in the built environment absolutely includes material supply chain and embodied, I'm certainly one of them. There is also a significant cadre of investors out there who have principled reasons, who believe that considering material selection is out of scope. That, in other words, these are the emissions for other industries, and that as real estate companies, they're not our scope. In other words, they are in the steel industry, the concrete industry, the building products industry, and that's where they should be reduced. I'm not saying that's what I agree with, but it's important that when you go around to LPs and institutional investors and you say, hey, we're going to be reducing embodied carbon, a fraction of those LPs are going to turn around and go, what? Why would you do that? That's why would you worry about that? That's something for the other industry to deal with. Again, that's important to have that context, that even though we're definitely ripping down the road, there are other opinions on how that plays out. So lots and lots to unpack. I'll just kind of leave it there for a second because it's exciting, it's vigorous, it is one of our top priorities. It's also heterogeneous and in its own way controversial. So.
Thank you, Chris. And that kind of, after Kaylee's and Chris, it leads kind of like to the next question with the issues that we encounter with challenges that we encounter with benchmarking when industry standards, calculation methodologies, regulations, and they are under constant development, or they are different from rating systems to even countries, as Chris was mentioning. So how do you all see these challenges in your world?
I can jump in first again. So from the analyst perspective, I would say with the lack of a specific industry standard to point to, or a specific methodology to look at, it sort of creates this idea of a moving goalpost almost. And what I mean by that is that this is something that we've experienced, and Jenny is aware of this as we've been building out our embodied carbon accounting program at Branch Pattern, is that when we started, the idea of embodied carbon accounting was much different than where we are now a year and a half later. And that's because our methodologies have evolved, more environmental product declarations and more emphasis is being placed on embodied carbon in manufacturing. So more data is becoming available. Our methodologies are just becoming more sophisticated. And so this sort of evolves our ability to account for embodied carbon, whereas now we're able to account for a lot more things. We have a lot more accurate data quantity or material quantities and data quality. And so it can potentially lead to what would look like from an outside perspective as an increase in embodied carbon, when in reality, we're just able to account for more, and we're able to be more accurate in that accounting. And so, I mean, this sort of goes back to the whole data quality thing that I was preaching at the beginning. I live in data, so that's really where my perspective is going to come from. But it's the idea of trying to start collecting data now, even before you even know what to do with it, because it is really going to lend to your ability to act on that information in the future. I mean, Jenny can speak to it now. Like, our embodied carbon accounting program has evolved significantly. And the baselines that we're able to set now include more scope in a project, which from the perspective of carbon accounting, that is the point. Like, you want to be able to account for every single little aspect. And that's a very tall task. It may not be possible to account for, every single cubic yard of material that goes into your project, but there has to be some end goal for where you draw the line. And that end goal is ideally as accurate as you can possibly be. And so the issue is really just trying to explain that to everybody, that or all the parties that go into accounting for this, and bringing you data and establishing that embodied carbon baseline, communicating out like why this is important, why we need to do it, and why your numbers may not look good now, but in a year you will start to be seeing that progress.
Thank you, Josh. Jenny, you want to go?
Yeah, I can go after Josh again. We work really closely together, so I think I'm gonna echo a lot of Josh's sentiments. But we do our best to stay on top of all of these evolving standards and requirements, but it is an ever-changing landscape. And so if I'm looking at an LCA report from a building in the US, there are going to be differences compared to, let's say, like an LCA report from the UK. And even though Prologis has, a standardized LCA methodology and a reference study period, which even with our reference study period, which is 60 years, we were going back and forth between 50 and 60. We wanted to kind of be in line with the industry standard, but even there's still differences there depending on what you're looking at, if it's LEED or BREEAM or SBTI. And so, yeah, there's still differences in how the embodied carbon calculations are made for those specific modules within the LCA, and that can depend on the location, whether it's in the UK or the US, and then the software tool being used. In the UK, they have the RICS tool through the one-click LCA, and that helps to provide some additional calculations for some of the B modules that we don't have for the US. And so you really just have to be able to understand when you're actually, comparing apples to apples, when you're aggregating all these LCA results from all of these different markets, which is something we do at Prologis, and why we are, so adamant about driving consistency across our carbon accounting program, just to have, as much data as possible. But that data, it's not just about quantity, as Josh said, it's also about quality as well.
And Kaylee, I'm really curious to hear your opinion because I stated the question as the challenges, but maybe also collaborating with all these organizations that you are, maybe you also see opportunities. So challenges and opportunities, or?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. So Bureau Happel's a global firm, and in creating our building performance dashboard, we operate business in different parts of Asia, so mainland China and Hong Kong and India and the Middle East and different parts of Europe and the UK and the US. Everyone is in very different stages of decarbonization. Even if you look at grid decarbonization targets, it's 2070 in India, it's the carbon cap in mainland China. It doesn't even happen until 2030. You've got different things happening in the UK and the US. So that is one thing on the operational side. And then if you look at like the UK GBC is setting their net zero targets, which are not zero, but they're setting reasonable targets around EUI, and then they're setting different targets for around kg CO2 per meter squared by building typology for their net zero baseline, which is great because you're getting these very specific kind of benchmarks that you're supposed to achieve per UK GBC. by topology of building for that region, which makes a lot of sense if we were able to get to that point where we said, this is what achievable looks like today for these scopes, and kind of being very clear about that. But not every region is at that point. And then you can look to Denmark, where you've got the 12 kg CO2 per meter squared per year total. That's for operations and embodied. Very tricky because, and their reference study period is 50 years. So then you get to 600 kg CO2 total for operations and embodied for, and that's inclusive of some MEP items as well. So it's very explicit about what that includes embodied wise. So you have some very specific items you could point to globally in terms of benchmarks that people are setting, but other people, it's just Wild West. Nobody knows what good looks like. And we've kind of always had this number around like 500-ish for structures, foundations, and enclosures, because it's kind of been floating out there, or like ILFI has set that target. Okay, well, we don't know. I think we don't know is the answer. And different places would inherently have different targets because you're going to require different amounts of energy, different amounts of stuff in the embodied carbon category. What you include would require you to have different amounts of stuff if you're going to measure all of your interiors embodied carbon. I think the world should be in a state where measuring more is a good thing. You should measure as much as you possibly can today based on the data that you have, and we should really be pushing manufacturers to have more transparency. To Chris's point, that is someone else's problem and the kind of scope 1, scope 2 of someone else. However, and they need to decarbonize that sector because we can't do anything about that ourselves. We need to be pushing them to decarbonize. It's not just about cement and steel. I think other industries should be decarbonizing other than just those. But I think that this is a really multifaceted problem, but measurement will help us to set baselines and benchmarks. And that's what the US needs to do a better job of. But I think having a really clear baseline for how to measure, what to measure is a bit of a first step.
Thank you, Kaylee. Chris was ready.
Well, I'll pile in. I feel like I'm gonna be a little. I'm gonna build on it, but I'm also gonna be I'm gonna offer maybe a different perspective. Look, actually, let me tell a different story for a second and do it by analogy. There are a couple things that we talked about that I don't love. And I want to explain why I don't love them. And I think we really should ask ourselves why we're doing it. I think we should be deeply cautious about adding together embodied emissions along with operational emissions or emissions from other sources. They are not the same. They're not the same basis of calculation. They're not the same competence. They don't represent the same time intervals. Don't do it. I know people want to do it, but my personal as a scientist, these numbers, they all have metric ton CO2 in them, but that doesn't mean you can add them. And so I think we need to be careful and to avoid the temptation that a number that looks the same should be added, and a number from one country, from one database, from one method is not the same ton as another ton. What are you doing? And what are you really saying? And let me give you one concrete example, only pun, only slightly intended. So we all maybe casually are aware of the WARM model for the US EPA WARM model for waste reduction, right? It turns a municipal waste stream into metric ton CO2. And we kind of take that tool for granted, and it's great and candy. How many folks remember that when you read the instructions on the WARM tool, it says these numbers are only relatively correct. Don't add them to anything. Don't go buy offsets against these. These are relatively correct because they were designed to understand recycling options or diversion options so that you could say the relative amount of reduction of emissions reduced from one to the other. I think at least for me, where we are with embodied is I can understand how we get to a warm world. And by that, I mean the warm calculator world, where numbers are relatively correct between scenarios for a building at a site. I don't know how we get to, I love the idea that we'll eventually get to the benchmarkable world, the UKGBC world, but I think we need to go through the relatively correct version where we can control for a lot of the variables. So I guess I have two kind of, the luxury of going last. I would say, please think very carefully about adding life cycle emissions to operational emissions because they're not the same. think really hard about that and make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And then ask yourself before we take the easier route and look for relative reductions before getting really excited about benchmarking. Because as actually echoing a bit of Kaylee, it's saying we still struggle to benchmark operational energy, let alone embodied. So we're probably 10 or 20 years further down the road on having, so we're bad enough at benchmarking operational energy. So anyway, I don't want to be a contrarian. We can act on this, but let's take a minute, take a breath. So anyway, thanks.
Chris, can I add to that just for people who might not know the unknowns that you're referring to there? So in the operational world, here are some of the unknowns that I'm projecting that I think you're thinking about there. In terms of the grid factors associated with electricity, we're talking about, we don't know if people are going to actually decarbonize their grids, right? We don't know if that's going to happen, but everyone's assuming it's going to happen. So we're assuming that the electricity grid's going to get better and better and better and better throughout the 60-year life of your building. And that's if you're all electric at the start, right? You might have some natural gas or diesel in your buildings, or maybe you're running on district energy. So that's an unknown in the space of operational. But let's talk about the unknowns in the embodied world, which is more disconcerting to me. I think your unknown, that's the single unknown, I would say, of there may be a couple of others in the operational world, but I think I'm actually more concerned about the unknowns in the embodied space because we have so many unknowns in the use space. Nobody is accounting for refrigerant emissions, which is incredibly concerning to me because the world is warming a lot because of refrigerants that leak out every day. Could do a cabaret to this. But that is one. No one's accounting for most of what actually pollutes the atmosphere. And then there's also the fact that we don't account for replacements properly in a lot of the systems that actually do get replaced, right? So interiors and MEP, or we take vast underestimates of how much waste there actually is associated with that. And then we try to take account for D and that's actually an overestimate of what actually does get recycled, right? So I think that actually beyond A1 to A3, whole bucket of unknown of what happens beyond day one of a building. And I think that that's more scary to me.
Thank you, Kaylee. And this is the discussion that I want to continue after the last question, because yeah, there's a lot of I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have a lot to say as well. So let's get our third question so we can go to the Q&A, and let's keep it to a couple of minutes if we can each. And the question is, how can meaningful targets be set when there are stakeholder regulations and market opportunities that might be different based on location? And here comes back again, like globally and also from the owner's perspective or consultants working in different regions around the world, even in the US, sorry.
I can jump in here again. So I think the big thing here is figuring out what works best for you. Because like I said back in the beginning, like one size does not necessarily fit all with trying to set targets for embodied carbon. I think one good example of that is going back to that energy uncertainty. A big piece of embodied carbon is how clean is the energy that was used to produce the materials that you are then using to build your building with. And here in the US, not every energy subregion was created equal. And so what a baseline for embodied carbon in, say, New York would be much different from a baseline for embodied carbon in, say, West Virginia. And so I think taking into those regional specific aspects is vitally important for understanding how to set goals, because where you're sourcing your materials from, where you're building, the types of materials and the amounts of materials you have to use is very different. Like in California, they have a lot more seismic responsibilities, and so they need sometimes more materials for some of their structural. But those specific regional aspects really play a lot into your ability to set that internal baseline and then improve upon that baseline going forwards. So looking at region, market, building use type, all of those things really play into your ability to set meaningful targets. And comparing your targets to somebody else's targets may not be apples to apples. It shouldn't necessarily be a comparison of one project to the other. It should be a comparison of where you're at now and where you can be in the future.
Oh, and I can go after Josh since that seems to be the order of things. So honestly, this is something that we're still working through at Prologis, is trying to determine how can we set these meaningful targets. And right now, I think we're focused on learning as much as we can about sustainable material alternatives through our LCA studies. That's going to help us identify high impact and also realistic areas of opportunity for embodied carbon reduction. So, we have a project in San Leandro, California. It's an infill project. And instead of completely demolishing the building, starting fresh, we actually incorporated a significant amount of building reuse into the project. And we were able to reuse a significant portion of the building that accounted for a 7% overall embodied carbon reduction, which kind of doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually huge. And so because of the location of that project, we actually used that to our advantage, and it was a perfect opportunity to explore the building reuse, and we were able to utilize the unique market conditions to our advantage in that situation. So, I think building circularity and building reuse is talked about a lot, but at least at Prologis, that wasn't something that we realized would have such a big impact. And so we're learning and we're understanding all of these carbon reduction strategies and almost building like a toolbox of sustainable building attributes and their associated embodied carbon reductions. And then this is helping us to be as prepared as possible to address our net zero goals, determine what those targets are going to be, how we're going to reach net zero. And then I noticed someone in the chat was talking about, different customer needs and wants and desires in terms of decarbonization and net zero. And so that helps us address that as well, as just, having the information about what options are out there and then being ready to implement those and as effectively as possible. So.
I like the idea of reduction strategies rather than targets, because if we don't have targets, you can target against yourself. I think that was a good point from Josh too. But I think we've learned so much from the knowledge communities in SE 2050 and MEP 2040 and AIA 2030 and Infrastructure 2050. You can find these big pockets and kind of gold mines of knowledge where we've learned what actually helps to decarbonize within those individual sectors. So I think looking to those knowledge communities to figure out how can I reduce the embodied carbon without actually having to measure anything. I think changing out the refrigerant on your project, looking at your column spacing, reducing slab thickness, looking at your concrete spec. I think all of those are things that you can do without measuring anything, actually. So I think there are lots of different choices you can make. Just be careful of the knock-on effects. You obviously don't want to remove all the insulation in your facade because you'll have knock-on effects of the operational carbon. So I'd just say be careful. Some choices have unintended consequences.
I get to, I mean, I think if I'm wrapping up, I get to just kind of say, I really like everyone's answers. This is fantastic. I mean, I like everything that was just said. So it's like, amen. I would just kind of maybe in my own words, put it to say, look, you can never go wrong with transparency and asking for information and creating that market driver for more information about the stuff that's going into our buildings. Every single, that is literally a market transformation action, the act of asking, in addition to the information you got back, right? So you never go wrong with that. The second one is I really like this scenarios. And as Jenny was saying, you can go back to the well and say, building and material reuse are sure wins. And then you have these reduction strategies you can layer on top with increasing levels of sophistication. I think you could probably drive yourself nuts trying to set up benchmarks or comparisons or targets, and you might not be as productive as doing exactly what Kaylee just said. So anyway, that's just, those are things that echo with me and saying you don't have to I think some people view this issue as paralyzing because they're like, hey, it's too uncertain, it's too complex. But that's actually, even though it is uncertain and it is complex, it doesn't need to be paralyzing. There are affirmative steps forward, like the ones we just heard. So that's I think pretty optimistic, actually.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Well, we have like 13 minutes about, based on my clock, for the Q&A. And I see a few questions already in the chat. If you feel comfortable, please turn your camera on. And currently seems to be the first person having a questions here on the chat. If you feel, I don't know if, yep, it seems like you're here still. If not, I can ask the question for you. Okay. So the question or the comment, if we want to start doing upfront embodied carbon on just product phase, A1 through A3 in early design or before construction, what methodology and what types of materials would you recommend? Concrete, asphalt, steel only, or more? And then there's follow-up that we'll ask to Kaylee in a minute here. So
jump in here to start. In terms of material recommendations, that again really depends on your project. I can give the piece of information of that concrete and steel are typically the highest impact items, especially in a line of work that myself and Jenny are in with these big warehouse projects. It is driven by sort of a two-pronged spear. One, the concrete and steel are used in the highest amounts in these buildings. And two, they are just intrinsically very high carbon intensity for the materials. Concrete is the real big one because it is so energy intensive. And that also goes back to my point that it depends on the energy that goes into producing concrete that really impacts how clean it can be. And so a concrete produced in a dirtier grid is going to be much more carbon intensive than one produced in a cleaner grid. But there are a lot of solutions for that. We always tend to recommend supplementary cementitious materials and concrete mixes as one way to reduce the amount of ordinary Portland cement. That's really what drives the embodied carbon footprint of concrete. And with steel specifically, we try to emphasize high recycled content and lower energy processes for producing it. Because again, that energy piece plays a really big impact on that embodied carbon.
thank you, Josh. And another question is for Kaylee. When can we expect the ECO framework to come out? And is there any opportunity for other people collaboration that are not already participating?
So the ECHO framework is going out for a bigger circle of comment in the next couple of months. And then after those comments come back, I assume that it will go out for wider participation. So TBD on the date after that, but we're in final stages of agreement on the schema. It's a lot to get it. Imagine all of the different, so it's AIA 2030, SE 2050, Infrastructure 2050 or 2050, MEP 2040. It's all the individual schemas coming together. So everyone's got lots of opinions. Plus, we have to agree on all the different site characteristics. It's a really admirable endeavor. And everyone's around the table and very altruistic in their intentions. So it's really a wonderful collaboration to have everyone together, but it takes a long time to get agreement. Even just things like agreeing to sharing the site address is very, very difficult to agree on. So
would you say, Kaylee, maybe like the latest by end of 2025, you would say, or?
No later than mid to late 2024. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, great. So you're agreeing. Nice. Thank you. Jamie, you want to ask your question? I don't know if Jamie has jump off the call. So the question is, B6 and B7 will vary depending on regional grid emissions factors and how your municipal water is procured. Avoid fixed percentages of A1 through A3. It seems more like a comment. Sorry, I am reading this right now, but it seems more like a comment. And Kaylee already responded. Okay, question by Matt Jean-Claude, and he already jumped off the call. How do you all think about and account for uncertainty in life cycle inventory data? From his experience, the embodied carbon coefficient of individual materials across tools or LCA databases can be quite consistent for some materials or vary by an order of magnitude for others. That alone could drive even greater differences in LCA results than changing regulations. Thoughts?
I'm actually going to jump in here again. This is very pertinent to our current work in this. So at the beginning of this year, we spent the last couple of months focusing on revamping our carbon accounting program with the help of Prologis and our other industrial real estate clients. And one key factor in that is incorporating a percentage of uncertainty in our work. And so there's a whole methodology for calculating uncertainty, but it really goes down, again, I know I keep repeating myself, but to the data quality that you get. Uncertainty percentage, there are some standards that talk about it, but we set a maximum uncertainty of 10% in the whole building LCAs that we do. And it's calculated based on if the material quantities that you're getting are the actual delivered to the site. And so that requires validation from your project teams and your subs for the amount of material that they're actually bringing in. It has to do with the quality of the EPD that we're using. This is specific for using the one-click software, which relies on EPDs as the foundational block for doing whole building lifecycle analysis. So whether it's a product-specific or factory-specific EPD as opposed to industry average, which industry average EPDs is a whole nother rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down right now. It also has to do with the accuracy in the scope that you're accounting for. So, some things you would have to rely on benchmark data for, but other things you can actually get actual quantities for. And so the data that you're getting actual real quantities for, that's going to be your lowest uncertainty data. Whereas the information that you are just using benchmark or calculations for, that'll have your highest uncertainty. And so each individual material input gets assigned its own uncertainty percentage, and then all those go into the total project uncertainty. And that uncertainty piece is something that I think is going to continue to grow as more standards are produced and more of a standardized methodology is established for accounting for embodied carbon.
I'll jump in and just say I know this may not be the popular answer, but I put it in the chat as well. I'll go back to the warm thing. We've been doing, if we can't characterize something as basic as waste streams, we have irreducible uncertainty. The way we deal with irreducible uncertainty in this is to focus on relative measures of impact and within a homogeneous sandbox, which is generally a single project. Don't add them to emissions. It is not a greenhouse gas inventory, so don't treat it like that. And be really, really careful. And I would just say, don't attempt to compare across regions and countries. Just don't. And if you could, because I don't actually think there's that many applications for that. So if you can avoid doing the things where uncertainty is a big problem, like adding it to another number that has a different kind of uncertainty, or comparing it to a region just because you want to add it up in a report, just don't. Do focus on relative improvements and emissions reduction and opportunities to choose better materials and design buildings differently, because that you can control for most of the uncertainties, or a much larger fraction of the uncertainties. My 2 cents.
Kaylee or Jenny, you want to add something in a minute? Something?
No, I guess I'll go off mute to say I think that, echoing what Josh said already yet again. And I also think it's interesting what Chris said in terms of just don't compare data across regions and countries, because that Prologis is looking at LCAs from across the globe. And so I think right now we are in the middle of trying to decide if, aggregating all of those results and putting it into a dashboard, what are we actually going to do with that besides maybe just looking at the differences between the two and acknowledging that there are differences, but we understand that it is not comparing apples to apples at this point, so still work to do.
Yeah, I think the
Thanks, Katie.
uncertainty is just compounded from the EPD level upward. And even Josh, like you started to say product versus sector, but I think it's even within the product, because if you didn't nail the product specifically to your exact one that's actually used in the building at exactly how far away it was, I mean, there's so many different things that can go wrong on so many levels. And that was just the A1 to A3, back to my point before. How much uncertainty were we talking about at that point? It's not less than 10%. I feel like it's much more than that. But we're talking about relative levels, and every building's probably off by the same relative level of 50%.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I think we have Alexis wants to ask a question.
Yeah, so I dropped this in the chat, but my question is, considering all of this uncertainty around data, scope, comparing, benchmarking, all of those things, how do you guys approach goal setting and actually pursuing reduction strategies with your clients, like in the face of that? Like, how do you help them define what is quote unquote a good goal to have? And yeah, how do you just approach your strategies, and what's your philosophy around that?
And before everybody answer, we are almost out of time. So if anybody needs to jump off, thank you very much all for attending. I hope our speakers, our panelists have a couple of minutes to answer this question. And thank you all for attending the panel. Go ahead, answer, please.
Oh, I'll jump in. So I guess I read this question, as clients, we're talking about, customers, inhabiting buildings at Prologis. And so we're having increasing desire from our customers to they're interested in, a net zero building, and they don't even know what that means. And so we have to first define what it is that the customer actually wants, and then we can look to certain standards. There's LEED, there's SBTI, there's different ways that you can categorize a net zero building. And so having that toolbox that I mentioned earlier of strategies that we can utilize to help lower the embodied carbon. And then we also have ways that we can work with our customers to help reduce their operational carbon as well. And so just having the resources to offer to our customers, and in working with them to figure out what it is exactly that they want, and then working together to achieve that goal. So at least on the customer level, the way I read the question, it really just depends on first just finding out what it is that the customer actually wants, and then utilizing our toolbox to make it happen.
Yeah, and I'll jump in speaking from the consulting perspective, because our customers are Prologis and other industrial real estate clients. The biggest thing I would say in helping to set meaningful targets is trying to determine what is actually feasible within that client's ability to accomplish these things. Because I can go out and tell you to replace all your concrete with wood and you'll have a perfect building. But in reality, that's not going to happen. And in reality, like, meaningful targets can be like a 4% reduction to embodied carbon, because when you're talking about, the 50 million kilograms of carbon scale, like a 4% reduction is very meaningful. So it's all about setting boundaries of what is possible, what is feasible, and then working on like meaningful solutions of how to actually achieve those things.
I love Josh's situation. I'll just answer very quickly. I just think the answer is not zero, because I mean, right now I don't know how much is enough, but I know that more than zero is possible. And so what Josh said is, once you look and you've unpacked the options and you're setting a meaningful goal that is something greater than zero, go team.
Yeah, I'd say analysis paralysis. Like, just understand what it is that you can do, what is within your scope. If you're an MEP engineer, there are lots of things that you can do. Starting with refrigerants is a great place because there are lots of alternatives that you could put in your systems, even if you're just doing a retrofit. If you're looking at interiors, there are lots of alternative options for even ceiling tiles or your gypsum. Just look around at what your scope is on your project, and there are alternative options in the embodied space, in the operational carbon space. I would say just take a look at what's within your scope and then look to different knowledge bodies for what the options are.
Thank you so much, everybody that participated, all our panelists, and we are going to wrap up, and the recording will be available. We will post it probably on LinkedIn, and also we'll send an email if you receive the CLF Rocky Mountain Hub. And thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.